Hello, my name is Rónán Hession. I'm an Irish writer, the author of two novels, Leonard and Hungry Paul and Panenka. And today, as part of International Translation Day on the 30th of September, I've been invited by Literature Ireland to say a little bit about Japanese literature. I also review fiction and translation for the Irish Times, and I suppose the most relevant thing about me for today's purposes is that for a long time I've been a reader and admirer of Japanese literature. So just to outline what I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk through a little bit about my views on Japanese literature. I'm going to discuss a number of books that hopefully give you some ideas for your reading list. And I'm going to give some more general reflections about the influence of Japanese writing on my own work. So I hope that if you're new to Japanese literature, it'll give you a soft introduction and some ideas for reading. If you're already somewhat familiar with Japanese literature, I hope my own idiosyncratic take on it will be of interest to you. And if you're interested in my own writing, I hope to have an opportunity to be a bit more open and explicit about the ways in which Japanese literature has been an influence on me. I've done many interviews, I've been involved in many literary events and book clubs, and it's not something I've really had an opportunity to explore in great depth. So I hope that's of interest also. I'll also try and obey the golden rule, which is don't be boring. So if we can begin then, I'll just say a few things about Japanese literature and what I mean by that. First of all, in the simplest terms, I'm talking about literature that's translated from the Japanese language. The idea of nationality and creativity, nationality and art, is not straightforward. I myself am very proud to be an Irish author, to be called an Irish author. At the same time, my characters don't have a specific nationality. The books are not explicitly set in Ireland. And I have my own doubts about the extent to which creativity is purely an extension of the personality. I think it's more likely that it comes from a deeper place, and that my creativity doesn't have a passport. And my imagination, my inspiration comes from a more universal place, somewhere deep inside ourselves, beyond where matters of identity really touch. I think it's also important to reflect on our own culture as Irish people and Irish readers, and to look at our own celebrated writers, like Joyce and Beckett, for example, who lived overseas, who might have written in other languages that were then translated into English, and who had an international perspective, and their own complex relationship with Ireland and with the question of nationality. That's true in all countries. And I think you'll find writers, for example, it's always interesting to me to read writers from Eastern Europe from the 20th century. Look at Bohemond Hrabal, who the country he lived in changed its name 3 times. He's a Czech writer. He was in the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia. And then you looked at the history of that country over many years, it's had many different identities. Similarly for writers from the Balkan area. I think in the case of Japanese literature, it's also important to recognize that the really significant event for 20th century writers was obviously World War II. And the role played by nationalism and ultranationalism in the entry of Japan into that war is a major issue for Japanese writers to consider. So it's important to respect that nationality and creativity is a very complex issue in Japan. And it is a very complex issue for Irish readers and writers to understand from a distance. More generally, I think I have some very open ideas about artists. I think artists, great artists in particular, are available to everyone, but belong to no one. So ascribing them nationality and thinking thinking of them in the narrow terms of Japan or Ireland is to some extent a limitation we should try and avoid. But as shorthand, we'll discuss them as Japanese writers here today, using their language as the primary identifier. And finally, when I first started reading international literature, and my interest was initially inspired by Eileen Battersby, who was the fiction reviewer and reviewed fiction and translation for the Irish Times for many years, an enthusiastic reader of world literature. When I first started reading, I chose books from the countries I wanted to go to. But over time, I have learned to step back from that. I realize it's not the role of international writers to write a sort of Lonely Planet guide to their countries. While they do present insights about their society, about their countries, and obviously they're created within a cultural context, I think it's important for the reader to realize that there are limits to understanding a country through its literature. Fiction in particular, and I say this not in a pejorative way, is manipulative. It manipulates our perspective. The writer chooses what to show us and what not to show us. They also can influence our biases. And they can also, I think, choose to touch on subjects that aren't intended to represent the society they come from. So all that long-winded throat clearing is just my way of opening up the discussion, that we can enjoy the literature and discuss it without developing too firm ideas about Japan as a country. I am, as it happens, very interested in Japan. I've been there, I was only there once back in 2015, spent some time in Kyoto. I'm learning Japanese slowly on Duolingo, so my thumbs speak a little bit of Japanese. I don't know whether my mouth or my brain speaks that much. And for many years, I have had a reasonably serious interest in Zen Buddhism and practiced Zen meditation. So all those things are reasons why I'm interested in Japan, but they're not the reasons why I'm interested in Japanese literature. I'm primarily interested in the books because they are great books, because consistently I have found myself in those books. I don't see them as exotic or foreign or something different. I see them as something that's very accessible to me. And I return to them time and time again with the question of, what is it that speaks to me about this literature? And in a way, that's what interests me about doing this talk. It's been an opportunity for me to reflect on that. So with those few preliminaries out of the way, let's get on to the books themselves. So I'm going to talk about half a dozen books and try and give you a reasonable spread over the 20th century and into modern times, and a mix of the different types of writers, and to try and mix in my own thoughts about Japanese literature and how it's affected me as a writer. The first book I'm going to talk about is the first ever Japanese book I read, which is called Botchan by Natsume Soseki and translated by J. Cohn. Soseki is a major figure in Japanese literature. He lived from 1867 till 1916. And until about 2004, if you went to an ATM in Japan and took out a 1,000 yen note, you would see Soseki's face on the actual banknote itself. It's about just under a tenner, by the way. So a very common note, a note that everyone would have had in their wallets at any time. He did spend some time studying in England, which he described as among the most unhappy times of his life. And he lectured in English literature back in Japan. I mention that because it's important to understand that Japan and Japanese writers are not isolated from the Western tradition. And it's common among many of the established and indeed new Japanese writers that they are quite well read in Western literature and in English literature. I'm not sure that's necessarily reciprocated. I think the influence of Japanese literature on English language writing is probably more limited, and it's the poorer for it. He remains one of the most popular writers in Japan. His book Kokoro is, I think, the most popular Japanese novel of all time. He's also the favorite novelist of Haruki Murakami. And that's partly the reason why his books have been so widely translated in modern times. And it's not only the case that you can get a lot of his books in translation, but you can get multiple translations of the same book, which is an interesting exercise for anyone interested in the art of translation. Returning to Botchan, which is a book that was published in 1906. This is a story of a young, headstrong man, 22-year-old, who leaves Tokyo to go off and become a teacher down in a place called Matsuyama, which is it's on one of the smaller Japanese islands called Shikoku. He's been mollycoddled by the sort of housemaid in his house. He is quite naive about the world, but nevertheless, he's kind of bullish and very black and white. And he's a very likable character. This is a very popular book among young people. It's, to give you a Western equivalent, it's sometimes described as the Japanese equivalent of something like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn or The Catcher in the Rye. We see his experiences as he settles into sort of small town life, small town politics. Many of the students are bigger than he is. It's a very funny book. He goes out at night and he likes eating out in restaurants, not realizing he's being spied upon by the students. So the next morning he comes into school and on the blackboard is written, dumplings, yum, yum. We love dumplings in the red light district. And so students have been monitoring him and keep reporting on where he's been on the blackboard the next morning. So he gets bogged down in the sort of conflicts and the staff room politics at the school. Botchan itself, the phrase loosely translates as young master. And I think what's special about the book is its fresh, youthful voice. And I think it's a really good reflection on the translation by J. Cohn, that it reads like a modern novel. When you think that Soseki was a contemporary of Thomas Hardy, Hardy, who I love, has a much more, Victorian or Edwardian sort of style, very long poetic sentences. Whereas this, it's a very much before the era of the invention of the phrase teenager. Whereas Botchan is such an accessible book. I think before I'd read anything from Japan, I think I thought it would be kind of graceful, minimalist, serene, but perhaps a little uneventful or dull. That was my prejudice before I read any Japanese literature. And then when I read Botchan, I just couldn't believe it. I thought it felt like a modern Western novel. And when you're first exploring a literature, that's not necessarily what you're looking for. But when you find it, it's really makes you realize that it's much more accessible than you thought. As a book itself, aside from being entertaining and very accessible and a really good introduction, it's quite layered too. It takes place during the Meiji era, which is a period of huge modernization in Japan. So Japan was going through a period where it emerged from feudalism into modernization over the course really of 2 generations. So, a transition that might have taken 100, 200 years in other countries happened very, very quickly in Japan. So it's quite a layered book. You can either enjoy the characters, you can enjoy it as a funny young story, or you can also look at it as a sort of societal commentary where you can see what were the choices that were faced by young Japanese men at that time. And you have the small town attitudes, what's good about them and what's not good about them, which I think is recognizable from an Irish point of view. The second book I'd like to talk about is another celebrated novel and still very popular novel in Japan called No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. Osamu Dazai lived from 1909 to 1948. He was from quite a wealthy landowning family, and he became estranged from his family when he went off to live with a young geisha. He is still very, very popular among young people. And every year on the 19th of June, people gather at his grave on his birthday to celebrate in almost sort of Jim Morrison type adulation. He lived quite a troubled life. He was hugely influenced by Akutagawa, and it was a really strong ambition of his to win the inaugural Akutagawa Prize, which is the major literary prize still in Japan. He didn't win it, although he was nominated. But he was incredibly focused on his work, and he wrote quite dark novels. And he lived quite a dissolute life in terms of his sex life, his interest in drugs, in drinking. And that's very much reflected in the novel. He died in a double suicide with his lover shortly after publishing No Longer Human. And it's sometimes described as his last will and testament. It's written in the form of a discovered diary about a young man who really is filled with self-questioning, with self-loathing. And the translator, Donald Keene, who's an eminent Japanese scholar, explains in his introduction that the literal translation of the Japanese title is disqualified from being human. So here we have somebody, a character, who sees so little of value in themselves that they don't believe they qualify to be considered as a human being. He's very confused about himself. When he's young, he's very much the class clown, but is shook to the core when an individual, a fellow classmate, sees through him and knows that he's faking it. And what we see is a young man going through a spiral where he's in serial relationships, where he likes to be told what to do. He is constantly subject to interventions from his family, and all the time making poorer and poorer decisions about his life. It leads to quite a bleak and despairing downward spiral. So why did I choose it? No Longer Human is one of the most celebrated examples of what's called the Shoshetsu novel, the Japanese I novel. We are very familiar, I think, these days with autofiction. And probably the most popular modern equivalent is Karl Ove Knausgaard's My Struggle series. So books where the author, in a semi-fictionalized way, describes the details of their own lives. And in fact, they are a character in their own books. And sometimes this is looked upon as an indulgent approach to literature, as a feature of our self-obsessed, selfie-obsessed Instagram age. But actually, that approach to writing has a longer tradition than it appears. And the Japanese I novel from the early part of the 20th century is an example of that form of writing. In fact, some Japanese authors were accused by critics of making up some of the stuff that was in their books, presumably for dramatic effect. And part of what, Osamu Dazai's widow said was his problem, because he left her and their children to write No Longer Human. And she felt that if he was going to write about the deepest and darkest despair, that he had to experience it, and she had to let him go. So it was a tragic end for him after the book, and the book has a lot of darkness in it. There is, however, important distinctions, I believe, and these are very much my own thoughts, between the Japanese I novel and modern autofiction. And primarily, I think that's a cultural difference and a difference in terms of the sort of spiritual context for the two books. In autofiction, we have an assumption about the existence of a self. Self-identity is core to these books, and almost as a legacy of the sort of Christian Western tradition, where there was a belief in a soul, in a more secularized society, the self has novated the role previously held by the soul. So in other words, we still have a thing that we hang on to, an inner Rónán, if you like, in my case, as a reference point for everything we experience. And we live through that self. And in autofiction, it's an expression of the self and the identities that attach to that self. So in my case, a male, Irish, writer, parent, whatever. In the Japanese I novel, I think there is a subtle but fundamental difference, which is perhaps influenced by the thinking in Zen Buddhism, which is Zen Buddhism is effectively a series of techniques for examining whether the self exists. So interrogating the reality or the substantiality of the self. So in the I novel, and we see it in No Longer Human, there is a sort of penetrating examination of what exactly is that I? What exactly is that self? Is it a person's position? Is it a person's self-view? But all those things become changeable, and all those things don't withstand deep scrutiny. And it's that level of self-questioning and the absence of answers that keep the tailspin going. So I think it really underlines the introspective nature of the I novel, the fact that it's turning inwards to examine the self in a very fundamental way, as opposed to simply expressing the self. So in that way, there is common ground with autofiction and the I novel, but there is also some fundamental differences. In my own writing, I often shy away from questions of identity. And I think perhaps that's what appeals to me about Japanese literature. In Leonard and Hungry Paul, the characters have no surnames, there's no particular place, there are very few physical descriptions. And part of that is about making the novel styleless. So in other words, to allow a deeper examination of human nature, you need to pull away some of the shortcuts that people normally use to get to know somebody. I think there's also the introspection speaks to me. I think in the I novel, instead of having change brought about through events and through conflict, it comes about through self-understanding and self-awareness. So I think these are fundamental aspects, not just of the sort of philosophy that underlines the novels, but in terms of what the novels are trying to do. And if you're understanding autofiction or the I novel, it's, I think, important to be aware of a distinction in how that concept itself is handled differently across different cultures. The third novel I'm going to discuss today is by Yasunari Kawabata, and it's this novel called The Master of Go. Now, Yasunari Kawabata is a very, very respected writer, as is the translator Edward G. Seidensticker, who's an eminent Japanese literary scholar as well as translator. There have been, I think, 117 winners of the Nobel Prize for Literature. Only 2 of them have been Japanese. Kawabata was the first Japanese writer to win it. The other is Kenzaburo Oe. That tells you a lot, I think. We've had 3 Nobel laureates in Ireland. There have been 15 in France, 7 in Sweden. That breakdown in terms of nationality, I think, points to the biases in something even as respected as the Nobel Prize. There's an underrepresentation of parts of the world. For example, aside from Japan, China only has two Nobel Prizes. And we also see, if you look over the course of the 20th century, a very few female laureates for fiction. In fact, I think there have been more female laureates in the 21st century than the 20th. I may be wrong on that, but it's certainly improving, but it's still nowhere near parity. Kawabata had a lot of tragedy when he was younger. He'd lost both his parents by the time he was 4. He went to live with his grandparents. They also died. His sibling died. And he felt himself very alone by his sort of mid-teens. He had an engagement to a young woman, and it was only discovered, I think, after his death when reading his letters, that she had been raped by a monk in her teens, and his engagement to her was then called off. So a man who'd experienced a lot of deep sadness in his younger years. As a writer, the books that are cited, I think, in his Nobel Prize commendation were Thousand Cranes and Snow Country. And the first book I ever read of his was Snow Country. And I found it tough going. It's a short book. It's fewer than 150 pages. But it was very painterly. It was like your classic slow foreign film. Nothing happening, lots of atmosphere. And I found it quite ponderous, and I couldn't get into it at all. More than 10 years later, I returned to it, and suddenly it spoke to me. I began to appreciate his skills as a writer, his sense of atmosphere, his mastery of intimacy. And so I went around to read many of his books. And in fact, he's probably, more than any other writer, the biggest influence on my second novel, Panenka. I'll come to that, back to that in a minute. But The Master of Go is different to all his other novels. It is based on the work he had done as a reporter for the Mainichi newspaper, where he was reporting on the retirement match of a Go master. Go is a sort of strategy board game. Roughly speaking, you can think of something like chess, although it's very different in spirit. And this master, who was the last in a line of a long tradition going back many, many generations, was retiring. He was in bad health, trouble with his heart, and close to the end. And he was playing an up-and-coming young Go player. And Kawabata reported on this for the newspaper over about 60 incidents. And we visited those reports to create this novel, which is, I think it's described by the translator, Edward G. Seidensticker, as a sort of chronicle novel. Kawabata said it was his favorite of his own books. And what he does is he tells the story of the Go match. It takes place over about 3 or 4 months, where the players are locked away in various sort of rural inns with the dignity of the master, and then the more sort of hyperactive competitiveness of the younger player. It's a brilliant piece of sports writing. It's a brilliant piece of narrative. And it also has such depth to it. It is, in a way, a sort of elegy for the disappearance of a certain tradition in Japan. I think it raises certain questions around when you see the master, and it's upfront at the beginning of the novel that the master loses the match and that the master dies afterwards, or within a year afterwards. He tells you that at the beginning, so you know that this is not going to be a novel about plot. He gets the plot out of the way, and that's quite typical of Kawabata. He's very much of the view that it's the incidents along the way that matters. And again, I think there's a Buddhist influence there. He himself cites heavily from Buddhist texts in his Nobel speech, with the idea that every moment matters. They don't just matter because of what they lead to. And I think that's sort of in his style, this sort of contemplative style of writing. I think it also reflects on Kawabata in his younger years was closely associated with a movement of art for art's sake. So in other words, that art is a way of tapping in, or art is something to be used in a sort of purposeless way. That it's an expression of something a lot deeper. It can't be put to work for sort of lesser objectives. And in a way, in the match between the Go master and the younger player, you get the sense that, and there are references in the book to certain aggressive tactics used by the younger player, where the master feels it was like spilling paint or daubing paint on a work of art. He saw the whole game as a work of art. And I think that says something about Kawabata's mindset as an artist. That he was really pure, I think. It's interesting, the day after he won the Nobel Prize, or a day or two afterwards, he's interviewed on YouTube by a number of eminent fellow writers. And he looks kind of tired and open, possibly a little hungover. And they talk in a very relaxed way about what it means to win a Western award. In fact, he said, they probably didn't read it in Japanese, so the award should really go to the translator. And the other writers kind of panic that he's going to decline the Nobel Prize on behalf of Japan. But that's an interview that's worth looking at, just to get a sense of the man and his sort of sense of serenity. There's kind of something priestly and calm about him. But I think when you think about his art, in a way, I think the master is the one I think of as closest to Kawabata himself. And in writing, you can see that. Sometimes you see writing that's coming from a very inspired place that gets overlooked by more aggressively marketed or more topical or fashionable writing. And I'm sure that any writer reading this will feel some of that in the game between the master and Otake, the younger player. There are a number of technical things I think that you can see in the Master of Go that are in Kawabata's other novels. But a bit like Shakespeare, when he uses historical plot, you get to see the brilliance of his technique. Likewise with Kawabata, when you're not being sort of dazzled by the beauty of the story and you can see him in a non-fictional setting, you can see how good a writer he is. You see his economy with language. You see his brilliance with his peripheral vision and his attention to what's happening in the background. You can see how time and time again, the narrative invites a dramatic moment that he declines. And there's so much in that book for any writer. And because it's kind of episodic, you can read any individual chapter as a sort of scene and try and understand it. But most of all, there's just a grace and serenity in his writing that I really admire. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that there's something in common with the three writers I've spoken about already, in that they're all men. And it's unfortunately the case in Japan, as it is elsewhere, that when you look at the canon and who are the writers who've been celebrated and elevated and recognized, there is a significant bias towards male writers. That's unfortunately has been the case. I feel in particular there are many great female writers from the mid-20th century that ought really to be on the curriculum of every literature department around the world, but who are overlooked. I'm thinking of writers like Sawako Ariyoshi, Hiromi Satoshi, Deiko Kono. And what I have found is that it's difficult to get to get the work of these writers. They are normally available in sort of secondhand form, ex-library copies from the US, sometimes in cheap print to order copies. But it's literature of the highest standard, world class. And unfortunately, there are many Japanese writers of that period who are not yet translated. By the female writers who are translated, there are only a small selection of their books available. And they're in danger of going out of print and being forgotten. So I would strongly encourage you to explore those writers. But for the purpose of the day, I want to try and provide an introduction to writers who are more widely available so that people can investigate those and then hopefully go on and read more deeply. So the next writer I'm going to discuss is Yuko Tsushima. And the novel is Child of Fortune. It was originally published in the 1970s. I think it was 1978. And was recently sort of republished back in 2018 by Penguin. The two novels that are available are Child of Fortune and Territory of Light. And they're both translated by a New Zealand translator called Geraldine Harcourt, who sadly passed away not long ago. Yuko Tsushima is the daughter of Osamu Dazai, who I mentioned earlier, who wrote No Longer Human, the pink book I held up. She was about 1 when he died, when he took his own life. So she was raised by a widow, and she herself was a single mother. And one of the things that marks out her writing is the focus on lone parents and single motherhood, single parenting. I'm not sure I can think of another Japanese writer who has focused so much on that outside of the nuclear family. In this book, The character Coco is a 36-year-old woman. She has a 12 or 13-year-old daughter who is sort of heading into secondary school. Her ex-husband is the father of her daughter. She is currently in a relationship of sorts with her ex-husband's friend, and she still has strong feelings for her former lover who is married and has his own family. And she starts noticing the signs of pregnancy. And the central question in the novel is, what should she do about that? She considers whether to have the child. Maybe she wants a child, but not with the current father. She is considering an abortion. And really what we see throughout the novel is the way in which it does what the novel is very good at doing, which is looking at the perspective of the individual, looking at the setting in society, and looking at the plight of the individual in society. We see the contrast between everything that is expected of her and the very meager support that she gets from either the fathers, from her family, or from anyone in society. She works a part-time job as a piano teacher. She drinks a lot. Her apartment is incredibly messy. She's ambivalent about motherhood. She's a good mother, but she hasn't lost her identity or her sexuality or her sense of independence. She hasn't surrendered that to motherhood. And that makes her a very complex and I think compelling character. I think it's particularly for myself as a male writer, when I try and understand the perspective of female characters I'm writing about. I think of people like Yuko Tsushima and indeed other Japanese writers like Miko Kawakami, who I think are very good at portraying complex, believable, memorable female characters. And that also goes for Teiko Kono, Sawako Ariyoshi, Hiromi Satoshi. We see them, they are not victims. We are not being asked for sympathy. We are not being asked to take their side. They are not puppets of a wider social commentary. They are real people and they are flawed. And we get to see them in the sort of messy circumstances of real life. And I think Yuko Tsushima is a really brilliant light in that. So I'd highly recommend Child of Fortune and indeed Territory of Light. They both explore similar settings and circumstances and I think work together as a pair. And a very, very gifted writer. She died a few years ago, I think in 2016. I noticed when I was compiling this list that I seemed to go from the more sort of canonical, greats, and then the more I started choosing my books, I was going more and more to books that really spoke to my heart, personally, books that mean a lot to me. Those still great books and great writers. The next book is in that category, and it was a pleasure to reread it again for the third or fourth time, is Kitchen by Banana Yoshimoto. And that's translated by Megan Backus. Banana Yoshimoto is her pen name. She's named after the banana flower. And she also liked that name because it was sort of ambiguous from a gender point of view. She doesn't feel comfortable about, though she's not non-binary or identifying that way as far as I know, she likes to keep her those sort of gender labels at arm's length to some degree. Banana Yoshimoto, she published this book when she was born in 1964, and she was 22 when she published this as her debut. And it's interesting in the introduction to it, she thanks the manager of the cafe where she was working as a waitress for letting her take time off or the skive off to write the book. I think that's nice to see. I suppose like all debut novels, it's written in the cracks of time that are available in real life. So she's always said in interviews that the dual topics she returns to time and time again. And she is an iterative writer that way. She does return her books. You can read them almost in any order and they all seem to be in a way the same, but they're all kind of different. she returns to two main topics. One is the exhaustion from life felt by young people. And secondly, how trauma shapes us. And these are very youthful books. Even the books she writes now are still have that sort of youthful, zesty sort of energy. In Kitchen, there's a young woman who is orphaned and living with her grandmother. And at the beginning of the book, her grandmother passes away, which means she feels utterly alone in life. And she's taken in, this is a 1988 novel, she was taken in by one of her college friends, someone she doesn't know particularly well. And his mother, who is or father, who's now his mother, who's a transgender woman. And she lives with them and really over the course of the book nurses her sense of grief. And I think that's probably the most defining feature of the work of Banana Yoshimoto, and something that speaks to me enormously is her handling of youthful grief. I'm from a family of 8 children, and my own father died when I was 7. And it's something that you do carry with you throughout life. I think experiencing profound grief as a young person has paradoxically two different effects. On the one hand, it makes you old before your time. And on the other hand, there's part of you that's forever preserved as a child. And a lot of what you go through in life is a reconciliation of those two. And I think Banana Yoshimoto is the only writer I've ever read who really gets that. There is a cheerfulness to her writing that she combines with this melancholy and a puzzling over the sadness and the gaps that are left in life, and the way you carry it through you, and the way in which when you meet people who've been through the same thing, there's an immediate affinity and things can grow from that. There are a number of different aspects to her books. They're almost kind of YA, I think, young adults in their style. They're very accessible. They're very gentle, I think. There's a light sprinkling of humor. And there's a sort of cheerfulness. I think she is probably my number one comfort read. And I don't mean that in a sort of faint praise sort of way. Comfort read normally means this won't challenge me and I'll just read something that would be easy and enjoyable. With her, I think whenever I sort of am unsure of myself or whenever I feel I need to find some support or to be nurtured by books, she's the writer I tend to reach for. There is something she gets in her books, a sort of strength through softness that is extremely rare. The final book I'm going to talk about is a book I've read a few times and I reread again the other night. And I'm not a crier. I'll be honest with you. I'm not really someone who blubs away at books, and I very, very seldom cry at books. But I cry at the end of this book every time. It is a beautiful, beautiful romantic story called Strange Weather in Tokyo by Hiromi Kawakami. And that's translated by Allison, Markin, Powell. Hiromi Kawakami is a very interesting writer. She's written quite a lot of novels that have been translated. She's also written quite experimental short stories. Record of a Night Too Brief, which translated by Lucy North, is a very abstract collection of stories. A lot of her books have been turned into films, and you can see that when you read them, they are very easy to visualize, and there's a lot of intimacy in them. The story in this book is of a woman who's she's 39, I think, about to turn 40. And she's quite a lonely woman. She doesn't have many friends. She's got kind of simple routines. She's not unhappy about her loneliness or her fact that she's single, but she is somewhat adrift in her life. And at the bar she goes to, she meets her old Japanese teacher, who's 30 years older. So this guy is 70, who she refers to throughout the book as sensei. And they develop this sort of quirky, though very authentic and very enjoyable, loving friendship. that flowers over the course of the book. It's a very soft book. It's a very romantic book. And there's huge beauty in it. And I think there are lots of unusual things about it. It's you could say it's an unconventional love story. Although I notice when Hollywood uses that phrase, the story is not even very, very conventional. The tropes in Hollywood movies, Hollywood romantic movies, are very identifiable. Even unconventional stories tend to be quite predictable. But in this, it feels genuinely unconventional, not just because of the age gap, not because of the context. And there's nothing creepy here in this novel, just to reassure people. I know people are probably a bit wary of stories where the older teacher seduces a younger student. I think the dynamic is different when the two ages are 40 and 70. And it is quite gently done. So it's a book that has a lot of very sophisticated technical things going on in it. I think the dialogue is really interesting. I kind of use the phrase, it's clipped dialogue. What I mean by that is that conversations don't start at the beginning and they don't finish at the end. You sort of get the middle of the conversations. And that's something I've definitely used in Panenka and definitely learned from. Also, it comes in at unusual angles. Conversations and scenes don't start, or the sort of starting camera position, if you like, is different to what you might expect. And it gives the whole thing a very fresh feel. And I think it really captures the originality of love. I think when you fall in love with somebody, there is an original feeling to that. And I think she captures that, and she uses great technical writing skill to convey that. So across those 6 books, I hope you get a sort of flavor of some of my favorite books and how they've influenced me, and some reading ideas. Of course, there are many, many other writers I could have included. There are many writers who are still obscure. There are many writers who are very famous, who I haven't included. But please don't take that as a reflection on them. I really just want to give you a sort of mixtape of books to help you enjoy Japanese literature and to give me an opportunity to talk about some of my favorite books. Before I finish, I'd just like to give some general reflections. One thing I've enjoyed about preparing for this talk is the ability to think more deeply about what it is that appeals to me about Japanese literature. First of all, I think a common thread along many books I've read from Japan is the idea that we have characters who are putting up a mask to society, and that there's a lot going on behind that mask. And the way in which, especially the Japanese mastery of first-person narrative, allows us to collude with the narrator in sharing the intimacy behind the mask. There's a lot of vulnerability shown. There's a lot that's shared in its almost trusting, childlike way. And I think that helps build trust with the reader. I think there's a level of disclosure and a level of freedom in the narration that is very refreshing. One thing I struggle with, I think, with a lot of modern American literature is the extent to which it's polluted with cynicism and irony and self-awareness. It's almost like the books are self-conscious about being books, about the act of writing, about the act of expressing. And there are all sorts of self-protections that are put into the narratives that I find off-putting. In Japanese literature, I don't see that so much. I think that there is an openness that I find refreshing and accessible. And when I say accessible, I don't mean in a sort of dumbed down way. I mean the reader is very much included in the book. I think there are definitely recurring tensions I've seen in Japanese literature. There's a tension between tradition and modernity, which is, I think, very obvious to see in many novels, and that's something the novelist is putting out forward. If you think, for example, Tokyo Yona Station by Yumari, I think that's an example of a brilliant example of that. I think there are also a number of tensions that are occurring across the Japanese literature I've read. One obvious one, I think, is the tension between modernity and tradition. And I mentioned in Botchan that was a feature, but it's still a feature of modern writing from Japan. We get a sense of a society in flux, and that change and modernization is not always a positive development. There are things that are won and lost in that. Secondly, I think is the tension between individuals and society, and specifically where there are societal expectations, usually articulated by the family, which would be at the expense of the individual's self-fulfillment. And again, I think there's also an extension of that is public expectation versus private reality. So where apparently successful people are unhappy, and where apparently unsuccessful people are happy. So I think, where successful people are unhappy and unsuccessful people are happy. So I think that's an outsider, slacker sort of mentality. From a technical point of view, I think we certainly, and this is something I've seen said about my own work, that it's to some extent plotless, it can be slow, and there's a lack of resolution. I think that's true when viewed from a Western perspective, and it's true when viewed from the perspective of the sort of what's taught in the creative writing schools. However, it doesn't really take into account the variety of narrative techniques that are available in world literature. And the more widely you read, the more you see that those techniques of, conflict-driven drama, that resolves by the third act, that is not necessarily a standard template around the world. And so the fact that those things are not present in Japanese literature is not a flaw, or is not necessarily makes them inferior. It just means that there are different ways of telling a story. And I do wonder sometimes, I mentioned earlier in my discussion of the I novel about the contrast between the Christian versus Buddhist cultures. And I sometimes wonder, and this is an open question in my own mind, about whether the idea of drama, conflict, and resolution is a sort of Christian-inspired view of the world. The conflict between good and evil, and that's how change comes about, through people overcoming the bad. And we have resolution in sort of Christian theology because people either go to heaven or hell. There's an outcome. In Buddhism, that's not how it works. In Buddhism, it's sort of outside time. It's about paying attention to everything. And change doesn't happen through conflict, it happens through awareness. So self-awareness. Greater understanding comes through observation and spending time with things. And of course, because you've no heaven or hell, because people, Buddhist belief is about rebirth, things don't end, they just change. So then resolution is not such a big deal because there are no endings. So I don't know whether that stands up as a proposition, but it's certainly in my mind when I try and reflect these things, and I'll continue to think about that. Over time, I think I'm paying close attention, since I started reviewing, paying close attention to what comes out of Japan. And I've read a lot of the new books that have been published in recent years. And one thing I hold in reserve is a question mark of the curation of what gets translated. I think we do need to be careful that publishers don't focus on the Japanese literature that they think will appeal to Western audiences, or that they don't try and emphasize at the expense of a wider palette of literature, that they don't try and emphasize things like quirkiness, things like sort of outsider perspective, or sort of a novelty value to Japanese literature. I'm not saying that that's happening, but I think there is a danger of that. I think there is a danger of a sort of subgenre emerging of Japanese literature for Western tastes. And I think there are some brilliant writers coming out of Japan currently, and I hope we get to see many more of them. And I hope we get to see a diverse range of books coming from Japan, not just what publishers think is the stereotypical breakout hit. And there still seems to be an emphasis on books that have won awards, the Akutagawa Prize and so on. Second thing is, I think a concern is that it takes a long time for books to be translated. The Memory Police, which was shortlisted for the International Booker last year by Yoko Ogawa and translated by Stephen Snyder, was first published back in the mid-90s. It took about 25 years to be published. So I take some comfort that even though I'm learning Japanese very, very slowly, it may still, if it takes me 25 years, it might be quicker to learn Japanese than to wait for somebody's books to be translated. So it would be nice to see the back catalogs translated. It'd be nice to see books translated sooner so we can get them read them sooner. So I hope that happens. My final comment I want to reserve for translators. There are many, many very talented translators of Japanese literature. We have Lucy North, Allison, Markin, Powell. We have Megan Backus. We have Michael Emmerich, Edward G. Seidensticker, of course, Donald Keene. There are a number of Morgan Giles. We have some very, very good translators of Japanese literature. We're extremely lucky to have them. And I am very grateful to them that my ability to read Japanese literature and my ability to even engage with it wouldn't be possible without their great skill and genius in conveying this literature in the English language. We're very lucky to have such a talented range of translators. And I'm really happy to see that some translators are now being published in their own right as writers. Polly Barton's excellent essay collection, 50 Sounds, which is a series of 50 essays using onomatopoeic Japanese phrases as the inspiration for topics. So I hope that when you read this literature, you keep in mind the work of the translator, you pay attention to the name of the translator, and that if you're using social media or discussing them, that you remember to name the translator. So that brings to a conclusion my talk. I hope that you have enjoyed hearing about these books, that I would have in some way piqued your curiosity to go and read them and to read these writers and others. And if you have read my own work and you're interested in it, I hope hearing me discuss it in the context of Japanese literature has given you a new perspective on it. So thank you very much to Literature Ireland for inviting me to do this. I hope you get to enjoy some of the events that are marking International Translation Day on the 30th of September, and happy reading.